I finished securing the last window latch just as the sun disappeared behind the ridge. 26 years of full moon nights, and I still followed the same routine my grandfather drilled into me as a kid. Check every window, test every door, make sure nothing could get in. The cabin felt smaller when I locked it down like this, but that was the point. My grandfather's first rule was simple. On full moon nights, seal yourself inside and stay there until dawn. No exceptions, no matter what you hear outside. I settled into the old leather chair by the fireplace with a book, though I knew I wouldn't be doing much reading. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around me while the rest of the cabin faded into shadows. Outside, the mountains were silent except for the distant rush of Cataract Falls, a sound I'd grown up with and barely noticed anymore. This part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park didn't see many visitors. Most hikers stuck to the main trails, and park rangers rarely patrolled this deep into the backcountry. My grandfather had built the cabin here decades ago, back when the rules about permits were different, and somehow I'd managed to stay under the radar ever since he died 3 years ago. Living alone this far from civilization meant learning to be self-sufficient. Solar panels for basic electricity, a well for water, and enough preserved food to last through winter. The isolation suited me, always had, even as a kid when my grandfather would bring me up here for weeks at a time. Around 9, I heard the first footstep. Not the random crack of a branch or rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. A deliberate step, calculated, heavy enough to belong to something much larger than a deer. I set down my book and listened. Another step, then another, forming a slow circle around the cabin. Whatever was out there was taking its time, placing each foot with purpose. My grandfather had prepared me for this. Don't panic. Don't rush to the windows. Wait and listen. The steps continued their circuit, unhurried and methodical. They moved from the south side of the cabin toward the east, then around to the north. Each footfall landed in the same rhythm, like someone conducting a careful inspection. When the sound reached the front of the cabin, it stopped. I counted 30 seconds of silence before curiosity got the better of me. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept toward the front window where a small gap in the curtains let me see outside. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing around my cabin, casting everything in silver and black. A tall figure stood motionless between 2 pine trees, maybe 20 feet from my front door. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face and a long coat that hung past his knees. He stood perfectly still, like he'd grown roots. Even from this distance, I could feel him watching the cabin. Then he turned his head toward my window. Our eyes met through the glass. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. If one of them sees you seeing them, don't look away. Don't run. Back away slowly and show you understand the rules. I held his stare and took one careful step backward. Then another. The figure's head tracked my movement, but he didn't advance. I continued retreating until I reached the center of the room, never breaking eye contact until the angle made it impossible to see him anymore. My heart was beating fast, but not from fear. This was what my grandfather had trained me for, the moment when the rules mattered most. I returned to my chair and picked up my book, though the words blurred together on the page. After a few minutes, the footsteps resumed their slow circle around the cabin. North to west, west to south, south to east, east back to north. The pattern repeated for hours. I didn't move from the chair, didn't check the windows again, didn't even get up to use the bathroom, though my bladder protested around midnight. The footsteps continued their steady circuit, sometimes pausing for long stretches before resuming. Somewhere around 4 a.m, the sounds faded into the forest. I waited until the first pale light crept through the curtain gaps before I allowed myself to relax. Dawn meant safety. That was another rule my grandfather had taught me. When I finally unlocked the front door and stepped outside, deep boot prints circled the cabin in the mud. Each print was identical in size and depth, spaced exactly the same distance apart. The tracks led away from the cabin and disappeared into the tree line, heading north toward the deeper mountains. I made coffee and sat on my front porch while the sun climbed higher. Steam rose from my mug as I studied the prints one more time. Perfect impressions, too clear and deep to be anything but real. My grandfather had died when I was 23, but his rules had kept me alive in these mountains for 26 years. The first rule was about full moon nights. The second warned about creek crossings. The third involved a golden retriever named Sam who showed up every few weeks. The fourth dealt with visitors who asked for water. Each rule existed for a reason, though my grandfather never explained what would happen if I broke them. I'd never been curious enough to find out. The coffee warmed me as I watched the boot prints dry in the morning sun. Whatever had circled my cabin last night was part of something larger, something my grandfather had understood but never fully shared. All I knew was that following the rules kept things balanced. And balance, in these mountains, was everything. The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I kept holding the mug as I studied those boot prints one more time. After 20 minutes of sitting there, I knew I had to follow them. I went inside and grabbed my hiking boots, lacing them tight. The prints led away from my cabin in a straight line toward the north, where the terrain dropped down toward Abrams Creek. Each step was clear and deep in the soft earth, like whoever made them wade twice what a normal person should. The trail they left wasn't hard to follow. Broken twigs marked their passage through the underbrush, and scuff marks showed where they'd climbed over fallen logs. I kept about 20 feet back, following the path of destruction rather than stepping in the actual prints. Something told me that would be a bad idea. The tracks led me downhill through a grove of towering hemlocks, their branches blocking most of the morning sun. My boots crunched through layers of dead needles as I moved carefully from tree to tree. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I got closer to the creek. I crested a small ridge and stopped dead. A woman stood motionless beside the creek crossing, maybe 50 yards ahead of me. She wore a flowing red dress that looked completely out of place in the wilderness, the fabric bright against the gray rocks and green vegetation. Her back was to me, but she stood perfectly still, like she'd been waiting there for hours. The boot prints I'd been following led straight to where she stood. My grandfather's second rule hit me like a punch to the gut. Never cross running water when someone else is already there. Turn around. Take the long way. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on her until the trees blocked my view. Then I turned and headed northwest, toward the rhododendron thickets that would let me circle around the creek's bend and approach my cabin from the far side of the ridge. The rhododendrons grew thick and tangled here, their twisted branches forming a maze of green tunnels. I had to duck and weave through passages barely wide enough for my shoulders, thorns catching at my jacket every few steps. It was slow going, but at least I was moving away from her. That's when I heard my name. Tyler. The voice was soft and melodic, carrying through the trees like music. It came from the direction of the creek, but it felt closer than that, like she was speaking right next to my ear. I stopped moving and listened. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. Tyler Harrison. This time the voice was definitely closer. I pushed through a thick patch of rhododendron branches, ignoring the way they scratched at my arms. How did she know my full name? I'd never spoken to her, never seen her before today, but she knew exactly who I was. Your grandfather told you not to listen, didn't he? Her voice followed me as I forced my way through the thickets, sweet and persuasive, like honey mixed with warm whiskey. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk back to that creek crossing just to hear what she had to say. I can tell you how he really died, Tyler. The truth about that night 3 years ago. I stopped again. My grandfather had died in his sleep, according to the medical examiner. Natural causes, old age. But there'd always been something about that night that didn't feel right. The way I'd found him in the morning, sitting upright in his chair like he'd been waiting for something. The rules weren't meant to last forever, she continued. He knew that. He was preparing to change them when his time ran out. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my ears, but her voice seemed to come from inside my head now instead of through the air. 18 years of following his rules, ever since I was 8 years old and first came to live with him in these mountains. 18 years of never questioning why. You don't have to follow his path, Tyler. You can make your own choices. I forced myself to keep moving, one step, then another, pushing through branches that seemed to grab at me with every movement. The voice grew more insistent behind me, but I refused to look back. Refused to listen to whatever promises she was making. The rhododendron thicket seemed to go on forever. My jacket was torn in 3 places by the time I finally broke through into clearer forest. The terrain sloped upward here, leading back toward the ridge where my cabin sat. I could see the roof through the trees, maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Safety. Home. I walked faster, then started jogging. The woman's voice faded behind me, but I didn't slow down until I reached my front porch, 30 minutes after I'd first spotted her by the creek. A piece of paper sat folded on the wooden boards next to my door. I picked it up with trembling fingers and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script my grandfather had used for grocery lists and margin notes in his books. The rules are changing, Tyler. Tonight will be different. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. My grandfather had been dead for 3 years. I'd watched them lower his casket into the ground. But this was definitely his handwriting, down to the way he made his capital T's and the slight slant of his letters. I crumpled the note in my fist, then thought better of it and smoothed it out again. Whatever was happening in these mountains, it was bigger than one woman in a red dress, bigger than boot prints in the mud or voices calling my name. I folded the note and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The paper felt warm against my chest, like it was still alive somehow. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that clung to the ridges. Everything looked normal from my porch. Trees and rocks and rushing water, just like it had every day for the past 3 years. But something fundamental had shifted overnight. The balance my grandfather had maintained was breaking down, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside after everything that had happened. The folded note from my grandfather, or whoever was pretending to be him, sat heavy in my jacket pocket as I spent the day pacing around the cabin, unable to focus on anything. By evening, I found myself settling into the wooden chair on my front porch despite my growing unease. 7 o'clock was coming, and while Sam usually appeared every few weeks like clockwork, something told me tonight would be different. The supernatural disturbances seemed to be escalating, and I had a feeling the old patterns were shifting. The 3rd rule was the only one that had ever brought me comfort. When Sam did appear, an old golden retriever would emerge from the tree line and spend a few minutes with me before disappearing again. My grandfather had called him Sam, and the routine never changed. Pet him, give him a dog biscuit from the jar by the door, let him wander around the clearing for a bit, then watch him head back into the forest. Tonight felt different, though. The morning's encounter with the woman in red still churned in my head, along with her voice promising answers about my grandfather's death. The note in my pocket seemed to pulse with warmth every few minutes, like a heartbeat against my ribs. I checked my watch. 6:58 p.m. The forest around my cabin looked normal enough. Pine trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint rush of Abrams Creek. A few birds called back and forth between the branches, settling in for the night. 7 o'clock arrived right on schedule. Sam appeared at the edge of the clearing exactly where he always did, trotting out from between 2 massive oak trees. His golden coat caught what remained of the daylight as his tail wagged in that easy, familiar rhythm. Everything about him looked exactly the same as every other visit. The graying muzzle, the patient brown eyes, the way he held his head slightly tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Hey there, boy," I called softly, reaching for the ceramic jar beside my chair. Sam approached the porch with his usual unhurried pace, but something in his movement made me pause. His tail was still wagging, but his ears were pressed forward in a way I'd never seen before. Alert, focused on something beyond our usual interaction. I scratched behind his ears the way I always did, feeling the soft warmth of his fur under my fingers. He leaned into the touch for a moment, then pulled away and looked directly at me. His brown eyes held an intelligence that went deeper than any normal dog should possess. I pulled a biscuit from the jar and held it out to him. "Here you go, Sam." He looked at the treat, then back at my face. Instead of taking it, he backed up 3 steps and turned toward the forest. His hackles rose along his spine, transforming him from a friendly old dog into something that looked ready for a fight. Then he started barking. Not the excited yipping of a dog who'd spotted a squirrel, but deep, aggressive barks that echoed off the trees around my cabin. His lips pulled back to show his teeth, and every muscle in his body went rigid. Whatever had caught his attention was out there in the tree line, hidden in the shadows between the trunks. My grandfather's voice came back to me. "If Sam acts strange, bring him inside immediately. Don't ask questions, don't investigate. Just get him behind a locked door." "Sam, come on." I stood up and patted my leg. "Inside, boy." He stopped barking but kept his eyes fixed on the forest. When I opened the front door, he trotted past me and positioned himself in the center of the living room, still facing toward the windows that looked out into the trees. I locked the door and drew all the curtains, just like I did on full moon nights. The cabin felt smaller with Sam inside. He was bigger than I'd realized, nearly 70 pounds of solid muscle under that golden coat. He sat perfectly still near the fireplace, ears perked forward, listening to something I couldn't detect. I was about to ask him what was wrong when a voice called out from the forest. "Help me!" The words were faint but clear, carried on the evening air like they'd been spoken right outside my windows. A woman's voice, young and breathless, nothing like the melodic tones of the red dress woman from this morning. "Please, someone help me, I'm hurt." Sam's growl started low in his chest, a rumbling sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He moved closer to the front door and crouched down, muscles coiled like he was ready to spring. I stayed where I was, remembering my grandfather's warnings about voices in the night. Never respond to calls for help after dark. Never open the door, no matter how desperate they sound. "I can see your light." The voice continued, closer now. "Please, I'm bleeding. I just need help getting back to the trail." The voice moved as she spoke, circling around toward the east side of the cabin. Sam's head tracked the sound, his growl growing deeper. Whatever was out there, he knew it wasn't human. "My ankle's twisted and I can't walk. Please, I know you're in there." Now the voice was coming from the north side, near the kitchen windows. She was definitely moving around the cabin, just like the huntsman had done the night before. But where his footsteps had been deliberate and patient, this felt frantic, desperate. "I just need to use your phone," she called out now from the back of the cabin. "Or some bandages. Anything." Sam positioned himself directly in front of the door, hackles still raised. His brown eyes never left the wooden barrier between us and whatever was circling outside. I could see the tension in every line of his body, coiled and ready. The voice grew more insistent as the minutes passed. "I know you can hear me. Why won't you help me? I'm hurt and alone and it's getting dark." Then the tone shifted. The pleading desperation vanished, replaced by something sharp and angry. "Open this door right now. I need help and you're going to give it to me." Sam's growl turned into a snarl. His lips pulled back to show canine teeth that looked larger than they should be. The sound he made was nothing like any dog I'd ever heard. Deeper, more primal, like something wild defending its territory. "You can't ignore me forever," the voice snapped. "I know you're in there. I know exactly who you are." My blood went cold. How did she know I was here? Was she working with the woman in red somehow? The thought that these entities might be sharing information about me made my skin crawl. The voice moved around the cabin faster now, calling out from different directions every few seconds. "I know you can hear me, the one who thinks he's so special because he follows the rules." Sam never relaxed, never took his eyes off the door. His whole body vibrated with tension as the voice grew more frantic and demanding. Sometimes it sounded like it was right outside the windows, sometimes farther away in the tree line. Always moving, always angry. "Fine," she snarled around 11:30, the sweetness completely gone from her tone. "Hide in there like a coward, but I'll be back. I'll be back every night until you let me in." Then silence. Sam held his position for another 30 minutes before his muscles finally started to relax. His hackles lowered gradually, and the constant growl faded to nothing. By midnight, he was lying down by the fireplace, though his ears still twitched at every small sound from outside. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Sam. We both stayed alert until the first pale light started creeping through the curtain gaps, marking the end of whatever had been testing my grandfather's rules. When I finally opened the front door the next morning, Sam had vanished again, gone without a trace, just like he always was. But this time he'd left something behind. Deep gouges scored the wooden doorframe around the lock, 4 parallel lines carved into the wood like claw marks. Each groove was nearly an inch deep, cut clean through the weathered pine. Whatever had made them was strong enough to tear through solid wood with its bare hands. I ran my fingers along the marks, feeling the splintered edges where the claws had dug in. The wood was still fresh, the cuts so recent that sap was bleeding from the deepest gouges. Sam had known. Somehow that old golden retriever had sensed exactly what kind of danger was circling my cabin, and he'd positioned himself between me and the door like a guardian. The third rule wasn't just about spending time with a friendly dog. It was about accepting protection when I needed it most. But as I stood there studying those claw marks, a new question formed in my mind. Were my grandfather's rules really keeping me safe, or was something out there testing their limits, probing for weaknesses in whatever protection he'd built around this place? The marks were too deep, too deliberate to be random. Whatever had made them wanted me to see them, wanted me to know exactly how close it had come to getting inside. I spent most of the next day trying to fix my water pump, but the motor had finally given up after years of faithful service. The housing was cracked, and no amount of tinkering could coax it back to life. My storage tank still held maybe 20 gallons, enough for 3 days if I was careful, a week if I rationed severely. The thought of hiking down to Abrams Creek for water made my stomach tighten. After yesterday's encounter with the woman in red, I had no desire to go anywhere near running water. But my options were limited. I could stretch my supply a few more days, maybe try to jury-rig something with the old hand pump in the shed, or face the inevitable trip to the creek. I was still weighing these choices when 3 polite knocks echoed from my front door. The sound stopped me cold. Nobody knocked on my door. Ever. The isolation of my location made casual visitors impossible, and park rangers would have called out by now to identify themselves. But these weren't the aggressive demands of last night's entity, or the silent presence of the huntsman. They were measured, respectful, almost old-fashioned in their restraint. My grandfather's 4th rule crashed through my thoughts. If someone comes to your door asking for water, you give it to them. No questions, no payment, no conditions, just water. Served properly, until they've had their fill. I opened the door. A man stood on my porch, hat held politely in both hands. His suit was the most vivid green I'd ever seen, bright as fresh spring grass and perfectly pressed despite the wilderness setting. The color was so intense it almost hurt to look at directly, like staring at a traffic light. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his silver hair was combed back with mathematical precision. "Good afternoon," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a drink of water." His voice carried the measured cadence of someone from another era, formal and careful. He looked to be in his 60s, with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. Everything about him, from his posture to his precise diction, suggested a man accustomed to protocol and propriety. "Of course," I managed, stepping back from the doorway. "Please come in." He followed me inside, moving with the same deliberate grace that marked his speech. While I retrieved a clean glass from the cabinet and filled it from my storage tank, he stood quietly in the center of my living room, taking in every detail with those sharp eyes. His presence filled the small space not through size, but through sheer intensity of focus. I handed him the glass, and he accepted it with a small bow of his head. "Thank you kindly." He drank slowly, savoring each sip as if water were fine wine. I watched him drain half the glass, then pause to meet my eyes. His stare was direct, but not threatening, more like a doctor studying a patient or a teacher evaluating a student. "Your grandfather was a wise man," he said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between us. He understood the delicate nature of agreements made in good faith. My mouth went dry. This was the first time in 18 years that anyone connected to the rules had actually spoken to me beyond basic requests. The woman in red had talked plenty, but she'd been trying to manipulate me. This felt different. Official. "But I'm afraid the old agreements are ending," he continued, taking another measured sip. "3 nights hence, when the moon goes dark, you'll need to choose." He paused to drink again, his eyes never leaving my face. I wanted to ask a dozen questions, but something about his manner suggested I should listen rather than interrupt. The formality of his speech felt like a ritual I didn't fully understand. "Your family has maintained a most delicate balance for 3 generations now," he explained, finishing the water and holding the empty glass with both hands. "A truce, if you will, between forces that might otherwise find themselves at odds. Your grandfather was quite skilled at the negotiations required." The note in my jacket pocket seemed to grow warm against my chest. My grandfather's handwriting, warning that the rules were changing. This man's words felt like confirmation of something I'd been dreading since yesterday morning. "The woman you encountered by the creek, the gentleman who walked your property 2 nights past, the voice that called to you in the darkness. They represent different factions in a dispute that has simmered for decades," he continued. "Each has honored the old terms out of respect for your grandfather's agreements. But patience has its limits." I found my voice. "What kind of agreements?" "The sort that keep certain territories neutral," he replied, setting the empty glass on my kitchen table with precise care. "That allow a man to live peacefully in these mountains without interference, provided he serves as a reliable witness to everyone's behavior. Your grandfather was trusted by all parties to report accurately and remain impartial." The pieces started fitting together in my head. My grandfather hadn't just been following protective rules. He'd been playing referee in some kind of supernatural Cold War. The isolation, the precise routines, the absolute prohibition against breaking protocol. He'd been maintaining a balance I never understood. "But you're not your grandfather," the man said, straightening his impossibly green jacket. "And the world has changed since his agreements were made. Some parties wish to renegotiate the terms. Others prefer more direct approaches to solving their differences." His pale eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. 3 nights hence, when the moon goes dark, they will converge on this property. The old rules will protect you until then, but no longer. You must decide whether to uphold your grandfather's arrangements or allow new ones to be forged." The weight of what he was telling me settled in my chest like a stone. Everything I had experienced over the past few days had been leading to this moment. The escalating visits, the testing of boundaries, the note warning me that change was coming. "What happens if I choose wrong?" I asked. "There is no wrong choice," he replied. moving toward the door with the same measured grace he'd shown entering. Only consequences you must be prepared to accept. But neutrality is no longer an option. The old agreements required a Harrison to serve as witness and mediator. If you decline that role, others will fill the vacuum your absence creates. He paused at the threshold, hat still held properly in both hands. Your grandfather prepared you well, though I suspect he hoped you'd never need to use the knowledge. The fourth rule exists because water creates obligation. An obligation, properly managed, becomes respect. I watched him put on his hat and adjust it to the precise angle he preferred. Everything about his movements spoke of ritual and tradition, as if he'd performed these same gestures countless times across decades or centuries. 3 nights, he repeated, stepping onto my porch. Consider your options carefully. The woman in red will offer you power. The huntsman will promise protection. Others you haven't met will present their own incentives. But remember, your grandfather chose service over dominance, balance over control. That choice served these mountains well. He walked to the edge of my porch and turned back one final time. Oh, and you'll want to conserve your water supply. The nights ahead may prove challenging. Then he stepped into the forest and vanished between the trees, leaving no trace of his passage except the empty glass on my kitchen table and the lingering scent of pine and old cologne. I stood in my doorway for several minutes, processing everything he'd told me. The mountain afternoon felt normal around me, birds calling between branches, wind rustling through leaves, the distant sound of Abram's Creek flowing over rocks. But underneath that surface calm, I could sense the tension building toward whatever was coming in 3 days. The broken water pump suddenly seemed like the least of my problems. I sat in my grandfather's leather chair, watching the last light fade from the windows. 3 days had passed since the man in green delivered his warning. And tonight the moon was completely dark. My water supply had dwindled to less than 5 gallons, but that seemed insignificant compared to what was coming. The cabin felt different in the absolute darkness, without even a sliver of moonlight to soften the shadows. The forest outside became a wall of black nothing. I'd followed my usual routine, checking every window latch, testing every door, but tonight those actions felt less like protection and more like preparation for a meeting I'd spent 18 years training to attend without knowing it. 9 o'clock came and went in silence. 10 o'clock passed the same way. I kept my book open on my lap, but the words might as well have been written in a foreign language. Every few minutes I caught myself holding my breath, listening for the first sign that the gathering had begun. At 10:47 I heard the footstep, the same deliberate, calculated sound from 3 nights ago, but this time it carried a weight that made the floorboards under my chair vibrate slightly. The huntsman had returned, and he wasn't alone. I could sense other presences moving through the forest, positioning themselves around my property like pieces on a chessboard. The footsteps began their familiar circuit, but tonight they moved faster, not rushed or impatient, but purposeful in a way that suggested limited time. South side to east, east to north, north to west, west back to south. Each complete circle took exactly 4 minutes. On the 3rd circuit, her voice joined the pattern. "Tyler!" The woman in red called from the direction of the creek trail. Her melodic tone carried the same honeyed persuasion as before, but underneath it I detected something sharper. Urgency. "Tyler, it's time." Sam appeared on my front porch without warning. One moment the wooden boards were empty, the next he was there, solid and real as the chair I sat in. But everything about his posture screamed alertness. His hackles stood rigid along his spine, ears forward, muscles coiled. This wasn't the friendly golden retriever who'd visited me for years. This was a guardian taking position for battle. "The old ways are ending tonight," the woman continued, her voice somehow reaching me through the cabin walls. "Your grandfather's agreements expire with the dark moon. You can step into something greater, Tyler. something worthy of your family's sacrifice. Other voices began joining hers, whispers from the tree line, low murmurs that seemed to come from the ground itself, sounds that might have been words if I could just listen hard enough. The forest around my cabin was filling with entities I'd never seen, forces my grandfather had somehow kept in balance for decades. I moved to the front window and peered through the curtain gap. Sam stood perfectly centered on the porch, facing outward toward the darkness. His body blocked my view of whatever approached from the forest, but I could see his tail held stiff and straight, every line of his frame radiating controlled aggression. The huntsman's footsteps stopped directly in front of the cabin. Through the window, I made out his familiar silhouette between the pine trees. But tonight he wasn't alone. Other shapes moved in the darkness behind him, tall figures that seemed to bend reality around them, making the shadows deeper and the silence more complete. "Choose, Tyler Harrison," another voice called out, this one rough and ancient like wind through canyon stones. "The neutral ground requires a keeper. Will you serve, or will you step aside and let others claim what your family has protected?" I understood then what my grandfather had really been doing all these years. The rules weren't just about survival. They were about maintaining a space where these forces could exist without destroying each other. The cabin, the clearing, the specific protocols for interaction. He'd created a neutral territory where supernatural entities could meet, observe, and settle disputes without violence. But that arrangement required a Harrison to oversee it. Someone trusted by all parties to remain impartial, to witness their agreements and ensure the terms were honored. I'd been preparing for this role my entire life without realizing it. The woman in red spoke again, closer now, her voice carrying new authority. "The old rules made you subordinate, Tyler. A servant to forces you never understood, but tonight you can change that. Accept our offer and you'll have power over these mountains instead of merely existing within them." More voices rose from the darkness, each offering something different. Protection, knowledge, territory. Revenge against those who'd confined my family to this isolated existence. The promises multiplied until they became a chorus of temptation surrounding my cabin. Sam's posture never changed. He held his position on the porch, like a stone sentinel, unmoved by the supernatural storm gathering around us. Looking at him, I finally grasped what my grandfather had understood. Strength came not from choosing sides, but from remaining steady while others fought for advantage. I opened the front door. Sam turned his head slightly as I stepped onto the porch beside him, acknowledging my presence without breaking his vigilant stance. The night air was thick with tension, charged like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I could feel dozens of eyes watching me from the forest, waiting to see what choice I would make. "I hear you," I called out, my voice carrying farther than it should have in the still air. "All of you, and I understand what you're asking." The huntsman stepped forward into the clearing, his wide-brimmed hat and long coat making him look like a figure from another century. Behind him, other shapes emerged from between the trees. The woman in red, her dress flowing like liquid silk. The man in green, standing with formal precision. And others I couldn't quite focus on, beings that seemed to shift and blur at the edges of my vision. "But I'm not here to serve anyone," I continued, feeling Sam's solid presence beside me. "And I'm not interested in power over these mountains. What I'm offering is partnership." The woman in red tilted her head, intrigued. The huntsman remained motionless, but I sensed his attention sharpening. Even the whispers from the tree line faded to silence. "My grandfather maintained balance through submission," I said, the words coming easier now that I'd found my footing. "He followed rules created by others, acted as a neutral witness because that's what was required of him. But those agreements were made for a different time." I gestured toward the gathered entities, addressing them as equals rather than superiors. You need someone to oversee this territory, to ensure your disputes don't spill over into violence. I need to understand my place in these mountains. So here's what I propose. I'll continue monitoring your activities and maintaining the neutral ground, but as a partner in the arrangement, not following inherited rules, but helping to create new ones. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Each entity stated their requirements in voices that seemed to bypass my ears entirely, speaking directly into my thoughts. The woman in red demanded expanded territory around the creek crossings where she preferred to hunt. The huntsman required guaranteed passage through the backcountry during his pursuits. Others requested access to specific landmarks, protection for their feeding grounds, or assurance that competing factions wouldn't interfere with their activities. I listened to every demand, weighing each request against the others, looking for ways to balance competing interests without creating new conflicts. The process reminded me of solving a complex puzzle, finding the arrangement that would satisfy everyone while maintaining the stability my grandfather had worked so hard to preserve. When they asked me to expand my oversight to include Cades Cove and the surrounding valleys, I agreed. The role they were offering would transform me from a passive observer into an active mediator, someone who could intervene when disputes arose and help resolve tensions before they escalated. These terms are acceptable, the huntsman said finally, his voice carrying the weight of official approval. But understand, Tyler Harrison, this arrangement requires your permanent commitment to these mountains. You cannot leave for extended periods. You cannot abandon your responsibilities for personal pursuits. The balance depends on your constant presence. I understand, I replied, knowing I was accepting a life similar to my grandfather's, but choosing it freely rather than inheriting it through obligation. The woman in red stepped closer to the porch, her red dress seeming to glow faintly in the darkness. And you understand that active mediation means making difficult decisions? Sometimes you'll need to choose between competing claims, knowing that your judgment will disappoint or anger some parties. I understand that too. The man in green emerged from the group, straightening his impossibly bright jacket. Then we have an accord. The old agreements end tonight. The new ones begin with tomorrow's sunrise. One by one, the entities melted back into the forest, fading into shadows and silence as quietly as they'd arrived. The huntsman was the last to leave, standing motionless for several minutes before nodding once in my direction and disappearing between the trees. Sam remained on the porch beside me, but his posture had relaxed completely. His hackles were down, his tail moving in a slow, satisfied wag. When I reached out to scratch behind his ears, he leaned into my touch the way he always had, but this time he didn't pull away after a few seconds. He settled down on the wooden boards and stretched out, making it clear that he had no intention of leaving. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. I sat on the porch steps with Sam's warm weight pressed against my leg, watching the forest wake up around us. Birds called between the branches, insects buzzed in the morning air, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the familiar rush of Abrams Creek flowing over rocks. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but I knew the fundamental nature of my existence had changed overnight. I was no longer Tyler Harrison, the man who followed his grandfather's rules to survive in isolation. I was Tyler Harrison, keeper of the peace in the Great Smoky Mountains, mediator between forces that most people would never even know existed. I went inside and found a notebook in my grandfather's desk, then returned to the porch to begin writing. The new rules would be different from the old ones. Guidelines for active engagement rather than passive survival. Protocols for mediation. Boundaries for intervention. Systems for communication between competing factions. Sam watched me work, occasionally getting up to patrol the clearing before returning to his position beside my chair. His presence felt permanent now, a living reminder that my role had evolved from protected witness to active guardian. By noon, I'd filled 12 pages with the framework of a new arrangement. The rules were more complex than my grandfather's simple commandments, but they reflected a more sophisticated understanding of what these mountains required. Balance wasn't something that maintained itself. It was something that had to be carefully cultivated, constantly adjusted, and actively protected. I set down my pen and looked out at the forest that was now officially my responsibility. The isolation that had once felt like exile now felt like purpose. These mountains needed someone to stand at their center, someone who could see all sides of every dispute and work towards solutions that served the greater good. Sam's tail thumped against the porch boards as if he approved of my thoughts. I scratched his ears and settled back in my chair, ready to begin the next chapter of my family's long relationship with the supernatural forces that called the Smoky Mountains home.